Well, I think it's incredibly unfortunate, especially with elected officials using such sort of vitriolic language that is completely untrue. How could we actually kidnap somebody? When we are a federal law enforcement agency, we work like any other law enforcement agency. When we make an arrest of an individual, we have probable cause to believe that person is violating a law, whether they're violating a criminal law that we're prosecuting an individual for that, or whether they're violating an administrative, a civil law under the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the system that Congress has set up. So our officers are just like any other sworn law enforcement officers. We enforce the laws that we've sworn to uphold. We do it based on probable cause. And most of the time when we arrest somebody in the immigration context, it's just like when you arrest them in the criminal context. It's the start of the process. If we arrest somebody for being here illegally, they still have the opportunity to go in front of an immigration judge to make their case as to why they can ultimately remain. Most officers don't actually order anybody deported. It's done by an immigration judge. The two main operational components within ICE, as you mentioned, are Homeland Security investigations, which primarily focuses on criminal investigations. So there's over 400 federal criminal statutes that Homeland Security investigations is responsible for investigating. So they range from anything from narcotics trafficking to human smuggling to human trafficking, child pornography cases, intellectual property rights, counterproliferation investigations, so the whole host of things which are critically important to both the national security and public safety of this country. Mm-hmm. On the other side, we have the enforcement removal operations. And first off, it's kind of a misnomer to say they're two different because we work so closely together. We're all part of one agency. And a lot of what we do goes into authorities that both entities utilize on a frequent basis. But enforcement removal operations, ERO, primarily does civil immigration enforcement. So they're responsible for the enforcement of the nation's immigration laws civilly. That doesn't mean they don't prosecute cases. They do. We prosecuted about 7,000 cases last year. Most of the cases that ERO would prosecute would be for individuals who have been here, have been arrested and ordered removed by an immigration judge, actually been removed and come back into the country, which is actually a felony. And most of the time, those individuals that have been deported and are prosecuted, those are aggravated felons. Those are individuals with murder convictions, homicide, rape, child molestation charges, very, very serious criminals. The biggest piece of misinformation with regard to what ERO does is who we arrest and how we go about doing it. The vast majority of people that ERO arrests are individuals who have been convicted of crimes. The second largest number of people that they arrest are those who have been charged with crimes, but yet are still going through that process. So over the past, and the stats are largely consistent over the past decade, but 90% of the people that ERO arrests are either a convicted criminal, have a pending criminal charge, is a fugitive, meaning that they've already gone through the immigration court process, been ordered removed by an immigration judge and failed to comply with that removal order, or they're a re-entry, meaning they've been deported before and came back in, which I mentioned previously. Those are felons. So that's what we do, that's who we arrest. So no matter how much misinformation is put out there, it doesn't change the facts. We prioritize our resources on those individuals who pose the greatest threat to our public safety. Do we do so at the exclusion of other individuals who are here illegally? No, absolutely not. We are sworn to uphold all the laws of this country that we have the authority to do. And frankly, you don't want law enforcement officers making judgment determinations as to which laws they should enforce and which laws they shouldn't. That's what the rule of law is. The rule of law means that those entities charged with enforcing the laws do so equitably and fairly, and that's what we do. So you ask Customs and Border Protection. They have two operational components as well, or mainly. They have the Border Patrol, which everybody knows where they're obviously up here in the northern border. You see them up in, but primarily they're marshaled along the southwest border, and they do interdiction of individuals and narcotics immediately at time of entry, and then they have the inspectors or CBP officers at the airports, which is the Office of Field Operations, a whole separate entity within CBP, which deals with travelers coming in, which deals with people trying to smuggle contraband through the ports of entry. If you're coming back from a foreign trip, and I'm sure the ones here, if you go up to Canada and the like, you're very well familiar with the CBP officers. The immigration laws have largely remained unchanged for about 30 or 40 years. The Customs Service and INS have been around for hundreds of years when you combine both agencies, and they all had offices here in Maine. They all worked all over the country. We have international offices. So all ICE did was conglomerate those two agencies in a fashion which we thought, and which was thought at the time, would be more effective with regard to national security, right? We were at a national security posture looking at things that allowed and enabled these terrorists to take advantage of our immigration system in many cases with the visas. So that's what it was formed after. again, I think the vast majority of people, if they truly understand what we do, and not only what we do, but how we do it, I think the narrative would be a lot different. And frankly, the narrative generally isn't being started by the people, the general public. The narrative is being started by politicians and those in the media with a certain ideological bent that they want to try to impugn upon the agency. A third of the people that work for this agency are veterans. So these individuals were heroes before they were strapped on a nice badge. These are dedicated, hardworking public servants who do an incredibly dangerous job in incredibly complex situations, enforcing, as I mentioned, over 400 laws, and often very dangerous situations. And they're your neighbors. They work in your communities, they go to your churches, they go to your schools. They come here every day doing their best to support and serve this country and the communities in which they operate. And that's one of the biggest misnomers. The executive order that President Trump put out in 2017 didn't create any new laws. In fact, it really didn't create any new policies. All it said was enforce the laws, Congress has passed it. So we've actually arrested more criminals every year since we have than we did in most of the Obama years. The Obama years, again, we focused and prioritized our criminals, but there are individuals who, depending on, that may be a criminal, but depending on the sentence that they received or the crime which they committed, we were not allowed to take action after. Part of it was based on dates. So you had a situation which, from an enforcement perspective, was completely illogical, in which you had an individual who would be ordered removed by an immigration judge on December 31st, 2013, and you could not take enforcement action against that guy. But the guy that got ordered removed by an immigration judge on January 1st, 2014, okay, take enforcement action against him. Again, when you talk about the fair application of the law, that's not a situation which is effective. So what we have done and what we continue to do is enforce the law fairly and equitably. But again, we are enforcing the laws that most of the law, the biggest change in the law that's come out in the immigration sphere is 1996. You know, signed by President Clinton. Those are most of the laws that we're enforcing right now. Things have slowed down, certainly, and I think you've seen the numbers, and you've seen the report that they've dropped for 7 months in a row. So that's certainly a positive and encouraging sign. But we're not outside of crisis mode. You're still having a situation where you're going to have, you know, 300,000 or 400,000 if we stay at this pace coming into this country illegally. That's too many, especially when we know that many of the people that are coming here are criminals, or coming here to do us harm. So until we get a situation where we do have smaller numbers coming to the border, and part of that border crisis deals with the interior as well. We have to be able to effectuate the removals of these individuals once the judge orders them removed. So all these people that come in and claim asylum, the vast majority of them, 90%, are not going to actually be eligible for asylum under our laws, and the judge is going to order them removed. Unless we actually effectuate those removal orders, you're going to continue to have that pull factor. People will continue to come to this country because they know they're going to have the ability to make that asylum claim, and if they get released into the country, the vast majority of them don't even show up for their court hearings. So if you're going to have a system which allows individuals to apply for asylum, and that those with meritorious claims that meet our legal thresholds get it, and those that don't, that system also has to have an enforcement component on the back end, so that the order from a judge, whether it's a grant of asylum or denial of asylum, has meaning to it. We have a warrant of arrest or we have a warrant of removal. And no other federal law enforcement agency anywhere in this country is ever being asked to ignore a lawfully issued order by a federal judge, except for this one. And we're not going to do that. What you saw in the spring of last year in particular with regard to the high volume of individuals coming were family units and undocumented children, unaccompanied alien children, being kept in Border Patrol facilities that were not built or designed to hold those types of individuals. But unfortunately, the numbers were so large, the individuals have to be processed, they have to be identified. When you're talking about children, they have to have enough information so that Health and Human Services can make a placement of that child into either a foster home or with a family member that's already here. So there's work that is going on nonstop, 24/7, trying to get these individuals out of those circumstances. But that's what when we talk about crisis. When you talk about humanitarian crisis, it wasn't just humanitarian crisis for the individuals once they came here, and the fact that there was just such a large glut. Part of that crisis was created by smuggling organizations and transnational criminal organizations that were involved and still are involved in child recycling. Many of those family units that are there or were presenting themselves as family units were not. We've had over 400 HSI special agents to the border last year. We've done DNA testing, we've done family fraud. We've prosecuted more than 1,000 cases of individuals who are posing as family units and they weren't. We've had cases where children are being recycled 3, 4, 5 times. So when you want to talk about humanitarian crisis, it's these criminal organizations that are taking advantage of our lax immigration laws and the loopholes that we've been asking Congress to fix for a decade under both administrations that they've refused to act on, which has set the groundwork that allows these criminal organizations to flourish and smuggle these children. So that's the real humanitarian crisis. And one of the big things you hear about is family detention, right? Family detention was created in 2014 under the prior administration because that's when we had the first surge of unaccompanied alien children, and particularly family units. 2014, once we were able to establish family detention, which family detention was set up to be a humane, secure environment, the children and the families were well taken care of. They were provided with all medical, recreational, educational services that were required for them. And they stayed in our custody for a short period of time while they went through the immigration court process, so that at the end of that process, if they were granted asylum, they could be released and go on about their lives. Or if they were ordered removed, we could actually effectuate those removals. When we started family detention, the numbers dropped almost by half within a matter of months, because most of the individuals, as I mentioned, aren't valid asylum claimants. Their claims do not meet the legal threshold to get asylum in this country. So what they were doing was gaming the system and trying to get released. The goal of all these individuals is to get to this country and to be released, because they know that even if they don't show up for their hearing, the likelihood of them getting arrested with our small number of 6,000 or so officers within ERO to go out and actually be able to locate and arrest them is very difficult and very challenging, and that's a risk that they're willing to take. Congress has every right, and that's the most frustrating and frankly hypocritical thing that I see, is when you have these Congress people come out and tell us that we should be ignoring the laws that they themselves have passed. We cannot have a system whereby the legislative branch passes a law, has it enforced for 15, 20 years, and then the administration changes, and all of a sudden, no, we don't want this law enforced. We want you to not enforce it, and tell the executive branch, no, not to enforce the laws that the Congress has passed. This just doesn't work that way, and it shouldn't work that way. So Congress has every right and every ability to change the laws if they don't like them. But frankly, there's not a situation, you're never going to have a situation in which the border is secure if there's not an enforcement of those individuals solely for the immigration violations. If you restrict, like we did during the Obama administration, largely restrict all civil immigration enforcement to those individuals who are also involved in other criminal activity, you are never going to stop that pull factor on the border, because people will continue to come because they know that if they get past the Border Patrol or if they get released into the interior, there's not going to be anybody there looking for them. That's not the case now, and that's why we've seen removal numbers go up. I think in large part that's why we've seen some of the numbers drop at the border just recently, because of what we've done down there with regard to these investigations into the family fraud, investigations into the child recycling, so doing DNA testing. So it's become much harder, and now what you have is those cottage industries that were created as a result of Congress's inability or failure to act have been largely curtailed as a result of our investigative efforts. Well, if they came here as asylum claimants and they're going through that court process, then ultimately, unless they get involved in other criminal activity, we would not take enforcement action against them. There would not be grounds to do so. But at the end of that court process, if the judge orders them or denies their asylum application and orders them removed, then they will be subject to enforcement action to effectuate those removal orders. Just as if an individual gets sentenced in court for DUI or family violence, and the judge orders them to be sentenced and go to jail, they get sentenced and go to jail. It's the same thing. We don't racially profile, and again, this is one of the issues where we continue to try to right the record with regard to us doing sweeps. We don't do sweeps, we do targeted enforcement actions. When we go out to arrest somebody, we know who we're looking for, we have a good idea of where they live, we have a good idea of what they drive, and we generally have a warrant in our hand when we do so. So we don't do random enforcement actions. If we go to do an operation at a work site, generally we've gotten a warrant from a federal judge to search that work site. It's generally part of a criminal investigation. You talk about the big thing was in the media a few months back when we did that big operation down in Mississippi. And it says, oh, we just went in there and disrupted the workplace and just did a random sweep. We had 14 signed search warrants by a federal judge. Just as FBI goes and executes search warrants, and DEA and ATF and everybody else, we execute search warrants issued by federal judges. That's what we do as federal law enforcement officers. We allow more than 1 million people come in here to immigrate lawfully to get green cards every year. We have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of asylees and refugees that come in every year with the opportunity to stay permanently. No other country is as generous with regard to the immigration system as this one. But that doesn't mean that we're going to turn a blind eye to illegality as a result of that process. In most places, what it looks like is criminals that the law enforcement agencies within that city just arrested for a criminal violation. It results in them walking out the door back into those communities to reoffend. That's what it looks like. It looks like less criminals getting off the street, less communities being safe. The sanctuary jurisdiction provides sanctuary to one thing only, and that's criminal aliens. Again, most of the people that we encounter on the civil immigration side, civil immigration enforcement side, have come to our attention through the criminal justice system. Most of the people, if they did not get arrested either by the police in whatever jurisdiction they reside, or the Border Patrol when they were trying to come into the country illegally, we would not know they're here. The reason we know that they're here is because they just got arrested for a crime. And when you look at what we did last year, we removed more than 1,900 people with homicide convictions, more than 10,000 people with sexual assault convictions. These are bad people that repeatedly prey on the communities. And most of the time, they prey upon the same immigrant communities that these politicians are purporting to support. What we do is public, right? It's public record. The immigration courts are open. You can go into our website and you can look at our online detainee roster and see who we have in custody. There's no secrets in how we do work. I know in the past couple of months, there's 2 individuals that were arrested for, child molestation charges. Most of the people we arrest, and you go look, and we do a report every year, it's on our website, you could see what we arrest people for. And you know what we arrest them for? It's the same violations that those police departments in those cities we arrested them for, right? So the individual that was arrested for family violence and was arrested by Portland Police Department for family violence, and they come into us, you know why we arrest them? Because there's a charge under the Immigration Nationality Act which makes that a removable offense. So we arrested them for the family violence too. Violated their status. So I don't understand how you could have any entity who was saying we're going to arrest this individual for these crimes, that they pose a danger, we're going to take them off the streets and put them in our jail, and then we come to you and say, hey, this individual has already been through the immigration court process. He has a warrant for removal. Let us know before you release him so we can come take him and get him out of the community. And they let him go. And then they get shocked when he goes on and commits further crimes. In some places, we've seen recidivism rates over 50%. These are not first-time criminals, most of the people we encounter. They get arrested again and again and again. And a lot of them aren't for minor crimes, right? A lot of police departments have moved to citing individuals for offenses and don't even book them into jail. So we get that information on the individuals when they get booked into jail because that's when their fingerprints get run. So if you have these sanctuary cities that don't cooperate with us, that don't accept our detainers, or do things like cite and release so that they don't actually go into custody because they don't want their fingerprints run, or they change their sentences so that the individual crime that the individual was convicted of doesn't render him removable, they've made their communities less safe. If you look at the media, how much media out there is talking about the criminals that we removed, the pedophiles, the rapists, the murderers? I don't see any stories about that. No, what you'll see about is the individual that's been here 15 years gaming the system that entire time. And yes, it's a heartbreaking story, and it's sad because their families may have to be separated as a result of this individual's criminality. But ultimately, it's up to that individual. Just when the police department arrests somebody for family violence and takes the father or mother away, and did they just separate that family? Sure they did. Every law enforcement agency separates families every day. If we're going to say that laws don't apply to individuals that have either children or a spouse, then you might as well just close down most of the jails and prisons in this country, because just about everybody has a child or a spouse. There's a reason why state prisons and jails have visiting hours all weekend long. You know who's coming in there? The family that they were separated from. Who separated them? Not the law enforcement agency, the individual that was committed the crime. The responsibility lies with the people that come here illegally. If you're here illegally and you put yourself in a situation where you know that you could be arrested and removed as a result of your illegal activity, whether it's immigration violations or criminal violations, ultimately the responsibility is on you. Just as if I go out and get drunk tonight and plow down the street and hit 5 cars and get sentenced to a year in jail. The responsibility is on me for me not being with my children for the next year. It's not on the Portland Police Department for arresting me for that crime. You will see a massive rush to the border like you have never seen. If you do not have an agency, both in terms of criminal investigations and immigration enforcement, that deals with what goes with the crime at the border, much of it cross-border crime, most of it emanating from all over the world. We've got offices in over 100 countries around the world. You will have drugs flowing into the streets. You will have criminals walking with impunity. You will have every single individual who can get to that border doing everything they can to get there because they know that once they get past the Border Patrol, there's nobody here looking for them. You will have a country that is less safe, both in terms of national security as well as public safety. And anybody that says that they're going to abolish ICE, if they're incredibly naive to think that they're not going to have to create some new agency to do the work that we ourselves are doing now. If you're saying we're going to abolish ICE, then okay, nobody's going to do investigations of all the narcotics trafficking organizations that are bringing fentanyl and other opioids into our communities and devastating some of them. We're not going to deal with counterproliferation investigations. So those sensitive military technologies that are being utilized by terrorists overseas that are being shipped from this country, just let that happen so those terrorists can use it against our troops. The thousands of child victims of exploitation, whether it's sexual or human trafficking, that we save and rescue every year, that means go ahead and just let them be brutally molested and victimized over and over and over again. That means that the 100 or so thousand criminal aliens that we arrested on the ERO side every single year that you don't want. The 250,000 people that we removed here for being here illegally, again, the majority of those being criminals, you want them in your communities. You would have a situation in which these criminal organizations would flourish. If you think you have trouble with criminal gangs now or with drug trafficking organizations, take away the agency responsible for enforcing laws against them. So the $775 million that we took from criminal organizations last year and seized, let those criminal organizations have that money and see what they do with it.